This morning had always been warm, almost deceptively so. They cast a glow that softened every corner, every face, every fleeting emotion. But on that particular Tuesday morning, something in the air felt different. It wasn't visible to the viewers at first, not in the cheerful opening banter or the easy rhythm of conversation that Ben Shephard had mastered over decades. Yet beneath the surface, something deeper stirred. Ben sat in his familiar spot, posture relaxed, smile easy, voice steady. To the millions watching, he was the same dependable presence they had welcomed into their homes for years. But inside, his thoughts were far from the bright studio set. "Good morning, welcome back," he said, glancing toward his company host, the ever-composed Kat Deely. She returned the smile, sensing nothing unusual, at least not yet. The show rolled on, segment by segment. Recipes were shared, laughter echoed, and the usual blend of light-hearted chatter and practical advice filled the air. But then, as often happens in live television, the conversation took a turn, small at first, almost unnoticeable. It began with a simple question. "So, Ben," Kat said, tilting her head slightly, her tone playful, "you mentioned earlier it was a big weekend for you." A pause. It was brief, barely a heartbeat, but it lingered just long enough to shift something. Ben's smile softened. His eyes flickered, not toward the camera, but somewhere inward. "Yeah," he said, exhaling gently. "It was Jack's 19th birthday on Saturday." He chuckled lightly, attempting to keep the tone buoyant. "I know, I don't look old enough, do I?" The audience laughed, as expected. It was a familiar line, delivered with his usual charm. But this time, the humor didn't quite mask what followed. Because in that moment, something changed. The cameras stayed close, capturing the subtle tightening around his eyes, the way his voice dipped ever so slightly as he continued. "It's strange," he admitted. 19. I mean, where does the time go?" The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Kat leaned in gently, her expression softening. "Did you all celebrate together?" Another pause. Ben swallowed, his gaze dropping briefly before he looked back up, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well," he began, "that's the thing. He was down in Bristol, with his brother." He let out a small laugh, but it carried a different weight now. "So, he wasn't anywhere near us." There it was, the crack in the carefully composed facade. To the viewers, it might have sounded like a casual comment. But to those watching closely, it was something more. A father, quietly acknowledging the distance, not just physical, but emotional, that comes with watching your children grow up. Ben shifted slightly in his seat, as if grounding himself. His fingers tapped lightly against his knee, a small, unconscious gesture. "I mean, don't get me wrong," he added quickly. "It's brilliant. They're off doing their own thing, living their lives. That's exactly what you want, isn't it?" He looked at Kat, as though seeking confirmation, not from her, but from himself. She nodded warmly. "Of course. It means you've done something right." But Ben's expression didn't fully lift. Because in that moment, he wasn't just a presenter. He wasn't the polished professional who could navigate any conversation with ease. He was simply a father. A father remembering. The years came rushing back, not as a blur, but as fragments. First steps on enduring. And now, here he was. On live television, trying to explain what it felt like to let go. "I spoke to him, of course," Ben continued, his voice softer now. "We had a lovely chat. He sounded happy." He nodded, as if reassuring himself. "And that's what matters." But the words trembled slightly at the edges. Kat reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm, a small, human gesture that cut through the polished veneer of the show. "It's a big moment," she said quietly. "For all of you." Ben nodded again, this time more slowly. "Yeah," he admitted, "it really is." For a second, it seemed as though he might say more. His lips parted, his eyes glistened under the studio lights, but then, just as quickly, he pulled back. Professional instinct took over. He straightened slightly, clearing his throat, the familiar smile returning. this time more deliberate, more controlled. But anyway, he said lightly, clapping his hands together once. Shall we move on? Otherwise I'll end up getting emotional, and no one wants that at this time of the morning. The audience laughed again, grateful for the release of tension. But something had shifted, because in that brief, unscripted moment, viewers had seen something rare. Not the presenter, not the personality, but the person. Backstage, during a short break, Ben stepped away from the set. The noise of the studio faded behind him as he leaned against a quiet wall, exhaling deeply. For a moment, he closed his eyes. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was something more complex. A mix of pride and nostalgia, joy and loss, all tangled together in a way that was impossible to separate. He pulled out his phone, scrolling briefly before stopping on a photo. Jack, smiling, carefree, somewhere far from the studio lights. Ben stared at the image for a moment, then shook his head slightly, a small smile forming. Unbelievable, he murmured to himself. Where did that little boy go? But he knew the answer. He hadn't gone anywhere. He had simply grown. And that, Ben realized, was both the hardest and most beautiful part of it all. When he returned to the set, the energy had shifted back to its usual rhythm. The cameras rolled, the segments continued, and the show moved forward, as it always does. But something lingered, a quiet authenticity, a reminder that behind every polished broadcast, every carefully timed segment, there are real lives unfolding. Real emotions, real moments, real stories. And sometimes, when the timing is just right, or perhaps just unexpected, those stories find their way to the surface. As the show wrapped up, Ben turned once more to the camera, his smile warm, his voice steady. Thanks for joining us this morning, he said. We'll see you again tomorrow. The red light blinked off. The broadcast ended, but for many watching, that brief moment stayed with them. Because it wasn't about headlines or drama or spectacle. It was about something far simpler. A father, a birthday, and the quiet realization that time, no matter how gently it moves, never stands still. Later that evening, at home, Ben sat beside Annie, the house quieter than it once was. He recounted the moment on air, shaking his head with a soft laugh. I nearly lost it, he admitted. Annie smiled knowingly. That's because it matters. He nodded, leaning back. Yeah, he said softly. It really does. Outside, the world carried on as usual. Cars passed, lights flickered, life moved forward. And somewhere in Bristol, two young men, Sam and Jack, were living their lives, carving out their own paths. Ben smiled at the thought. Because as difficult as it was to let go, he knew one thing for